My name is Victoria Bennett. I am 42 years old. And exactly 3 weeks before my husband's technology company went public, I discovered that the life I had built for the last 15 years was a carefully constructed lie. It didn't start with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful confession. It started with a mundane email notification on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my home office desk, reviewing the final S1 filing documents for Bennett Technologies. The subject line was standard: IPO final documentation signature required. My husband, Richard, had been working toward this initial public offering for 3 years. I had been the one managing the company's financial infrastructure since day one. I was the chief financial officer. I handled payroll, investor relations, tax compliance, and vendor negotiations. I was the authorized signatory on every corporate account, or so I thought. I opened the attachment, expecting to see the final equity distribution table that I had prepared myself. But as my eyes scanned the percentages, my breath caught in my throat. The numbers didn't add up. According to the document, Richard owned 70% of the company. His new VP of product, a 28-year-old woman named Ashley Reed, owned 25%. And I, the woman who had kept this company solvent through 3 near bankruptcies, owned 5%. 5%. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my laptop across the room. I just sat there, listening to the rain hit the window, feeling a cold, heavy stone settle in my stomach. I opened the original incorporation documents from 15 years ago. I had owned 40%. Richard owned 60%. We were partners. I pulled up the corporate filings from 3 years ago, the exact month Ashley Reed was hired. There it was. A shareholder amendment diluting my stake from 40% to 5%. And at the bottom of the page, right next to Richard's signature, was mine. I leaned closer to the screen. I know my own signature. I know the exact pressure I apply to the pen, the specific loop I make on the capital V, the sharp cross on the T. The signature on the document was a forgery. It was close, but it was a forgery. Before I tell you how I dismantled my husband's empire in front of 300 investors, let me ask you, what time is it where you are right now? Where are you watching from? And have you ever discovered that the person you sacrificed everything for was actively stealing from you? I'm asking because I need to know I'm not the only one who had to learn the hard way. My name is Victoria Bennett, and this is the story of how I reclaimed my life. To understand the depth of this betrayal, you need to understand how we got here. Richard and I met at a tech conference in San Francisco 15 years ago. I was 27, a senior financial analyst at a Fortune 500 firm. He was 30, a brilliant but chaotic software engineer with a vision for a new data analytics platform. I fell in love with his passion. When he quit his job to start Bennett Technologies, I kept my corporate job to pay the mortgage. For the first 3 years, I came home from my 8-hour corporate shift, made dinner, and then spent another 5 hours helping Richard build his financial models, pitch decks, and burn rate projections. When we secured our first seed funding, Richard held my face in his hands and said, "Victoria, you are the backbone of this company. We are in this together, 50-50. I believed him. I reduced my corporate hours to part-time to officially become the CFO of Bennett Technologies. Richard told me that to maximize our growth, I shouldn't draw a salary for the first few years. Just until we hit profitability, he promised. Then I'll back pay you, and we'll be set for life. I agreed. For 12 years, I worked without a salary. I managed the payroll for 40 employees while my own personal bank account barely scraped by. I negotiated with vendors to save us thousands. I stayed up until 3 in the morning fixing cash flow crises so Richard could sleep. He would pat my shoulder and say, "You're the best, Victoria. I couldn't do this without you." But 5 years ago, the dynamic shifted. Richard started traveling more. He came home late, smelling of expensive cologne and a floral perfume that wasn't mine. When I asked, he said it was from client dinners. I wanted to believe him. I thought the stress of scaling the company was just making him distant. I remember the exact evening the distance started to feel less like stress and more like something deliberate. It was our anniversary, our 13th, and Richard had promised we'd finally take the weekend trip to Napa we'd been rescheduling for 3 years running. He canceled that morning, citing an emergency investor call that, I now believe, never happened. I spent that evening alone in our kitchen, eating leftover Thai food out of the container, telling myself that this was simply what building something extraordinary required. I told my sister Karen the same thing on the phone that night, and I remember her going quiet before saying, carefully, Victoria, at some point, building something extraordinary just becomes an excuse people use so you stop asking what they're actually doing with their time. I brushed it off. I wish I hadn't. That was 18 months before Ashley was ever hired, which tells me now that whatever shifted in Richard didn't begin with her. She was a symptom of something that had already started, not the cause of it. Then, 3 years ago, Ashley Reed joined as a junior developer. She was young, ambitious, and fiercely intelligent. Richard took her under his wing. Within a year, she was promoted to VP of Product. Within 2 years, she was his strategic partner. I saw the signs. The late-night Slack messages that stopped when I walked into the room. The business trips to Austin and Seattle that conveniently overlapped. The way Richard's face lit up when Ashley walked into a meeting. I knew, but I stayed silent. I told myself that I was indispensable. I controlled the finances. I held the relationships with the banks and the investors. I thought my value to the company was my armor. I was wrong. My value wasn't my armor, it was my blindfold. There's a memory that surfaces every time I try to explain this part of the story, and I've never quite known where to put it, so I'll put it here. 8 years into the company, when we were still operating out of a converted warehouse in Emeryville with folding tables for desks, I found out I was pregnant with what would have been our second child. I was 35, exhausted, running payroll for 22 employees on a spreadsheet I updated by hand every Thursday night because we couldn't yet afford proper accounting software. I miscarried at 11 weeks, on a Tuesday, in the bathroom of that warehouse office, because I hadn't taken a single day off in 4 months, and my body simply gave out. Richard drove me to the hospital. He held my hand in the waiting room. He told me gently that we'd try again when things settled down. Things never settled down. There was always another funding round, another product launch, another crisis that made settling down feel selfish to even want. I never brought it up again, not because I'd made peace with it, but because every time I looked at our calendar of investor deadlines, it felt like there was no room in this company for anything I needed. I told myself that was the cost of building something. I told myself Richard was sacrificing just as much. I know now he wasn't. While I was folding my own grief into a spreadsheet so payroll would clear on time, he was, within 18 months of that day, beginning what would become his relationship with Ashley. I didn't know that yet, sitting at my desk 2 weeks before the IPO. But I want you to understand this. By the time I discovered the fraud, I wasn't just discovering stolen money. I was discovering that every sacrifice I'd quietly made, the miscarriage I never spoke about, the salary I never took, the 12 years of unpaid labor, had been happening alongside a second, hidden life I knew nothing about. The two timelines ran side by side for years, and I only ever saw one of them. 2 weeks before the IPO, while reviewing the final bank reconciliations, I noticed a discrepancy. The company's primary operating account was supposed to have a balance of $2.3 million. But when I logged into the bank portal, the actual balance was $47,000. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled the transaction history for the last 18 months. There it was. A recurring monthly transfer of $100,000 to an LLC I didn't recognize. The recipient was Reed Holdings LLC, Ashley's company. Richard hadn't just diluted my equity. He had been systematically embezzling company funds to finance his mistress's lifestyle. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I spent the next 72 hours acting like nothing was wrong. I went to work. I smiled at Richard. I cooked dinner. But at night, when he was asleep, I sat on the bathroom floor with my laptop, the only room in the house with a lock on the door, and I started building a case. The first thing I did was print every bank statement going back 3 years. Not digital copies, physical ones, because I had learned enough about financial fraud over the years to know that digital files could be altered, deleted, accidentally, corrupted if Richard ever suspected what I was doing. I drove to a print shop 20 minutes away, not the one near our house, and paid cash. I spread the statements across my sister's dining room table 2 towns over, because I couldn't risk doing this in our home. My sister, Karen, asked no questions when I showed up at 9 at night with a banker's box. She just made coffee and sat across from me while I worked, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand when my breathing got shallow. Line by line, I traced the transfers. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, always on the first business day of the month, always for a consulting fee, labeled in the internal ledger as Product Strategy Advisory. It was a line item I had personally approved months ago, back when Richard told me Ashley was bringing in an outside consultant to help with the platform's UX overhaul. I remembered signing off on it. I remembered trusting him. I felt sick. Not just betrayed, complicit. I had signed the very paperwork that greenlit my own robbery because I had trusted my husband's word instead of demanding to see the underlying contracts myself. That was a lesson I would carry with me long after this was over. Never again would I approve anything based on trust alone, no matter who was asking. I contacted a forensic accountant named Alina Rodriguez, someone I'd met years ago at a CFO networking event and had stayed loosely in touch with. I didn't call her from my phone. I used a prepaid burner I bought at a gas station, because by that point I no longer trusted that Richard hadn't put some kind of tracking or monitoring on our shared devices. It sounds paranoid. It wasn't. I later learned he had, in fact, installed a keylogger on the home office computer 8 months earlier, something Agent Miller's team would confirm during the investigation. Alina met me at a coffee shop in Oakland, far from anywhere Richard or Ashley might recognize me. She spent 2 hours going through the printed statements, occasionally making small noises, a sharp inhale, a low whistle that told me everything before she said a word. "Victoria," she said finally, sliding the papers back across the table. "This isn't sloppy embezzlement. This is structured. Someone set this up to look clean on a surface-level audit. Whoever did this knew exactly what auditors look for and knew exactly how to avoid it." Meaning this wasn't just Richard being greedy and careless. Someone with real financial sophistication helped design this. I'd bet money it wasn't Ashley alone either. "Do you have access to your outside accounting firm's records?" I did. And when Alina and I pulled those records 3 days later, we found something I hadn't expected. The Product Strategy Advisory line item had been quietly restructured 18 months earlier by our external bookkeeper, a woman named Denise, who, it would later come out in court, had been receiving a personal referral bonus from Richard for keeping the entries clean. Denise wasn't malicious, not really. She told investigators later she believed the payments were a legitimate, if unconventional, equity buyout structure. She hadn't asked enough questions. None of us had. Then I found the real estate records. Reed Holdings LLC had purchased a $2.1 million penthouse in San Francisco's Soma district 6 months earlier. The deed listed Ashley Reed as sole owner. The down payment, $650,000, had cleared the same week as 3 consecutive advisory transfers from Bennett Technologies. I found the property records almost by accident. Alina had suggested I cross-reference Reed Holdings against county assessor databases in every California county where Richard had traveled for business over the past 2 years, just in case the LLC held assets beyond the bank transfers. I nearly gave up after the first 4 counties returned nothing. Then San Francisco County returned a single result: a 2-bedroom penthouse unit on the 28th floor of a new development in Soma, purchased 6 months earlier for $2.1 million, listed under Reed Holdings LLC with Ashley Reed as sole managing member. I looked up the listing photos, still archived on the real estate site from before the sale closed, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. A kitchen with marble countertops I recognized, with a sick jolt, from a photo Richard had once shown me on his phone, telling me it was inspiration for the new office break room he wanted to design. I sat with that recognition for a long moment before opening the county recorder's deed transfer document. The down payment, $650,000, had cleared Reed Holdings' account on March 3rd. I didn't need to check my own printed statements to know what had happened 3 days earlier. I already knew. 3 consecutive advisory transfers, back-to-back, an unusual deviation from the steady monthly pattern I'd tracked for months, had cleared Bennett Technologies' account between February 27th and March 2nd, totaling exactly $650,000. I sat in my car outside the title company's office and cried for the first time since discovering any of this. Not because of the money, though the money mattered. I cried because I finally understood, in a way that went beyond financial statements, that Richard had built an entire second life, brick by brick, funded by 15 years of my unpaid labor, while I stayed up nights making sure his employees got their paychecks on time. I gave myself exactly one night to grieve that. The next morning, I went back to work on the case. I needed more than financial records. I needed the intellectual property documentation, because something about the equity dilution timeline nagged at me. Why now? Why 3 years ago, right when Ashley was hired? Dilution alone didn't explain why Richard had been so aggressive about pushing the IPO forward this year specifically, ahead of the timeline we'd originally discussed. I called my daughter, Sophia. She was 28, a senior software engineer at one of Bennett Technologies' competitors, sharp in a way that made me proud and occasionally unsettled, because she saw through people faster than I ever had. I told her everything over dinner at her apartment: the dilution, the embezzlement, the penthouse. She didn't cry either. She got very quiet, the way she used to when she was a little girl solving a puzzle that frustrated her. She said slowly, "I've noticed something weird for a while. Dad's company hasn't pushed a single major product update in almost 2 years, but their valuation keeps climbing every funding round. That doesn't happen organically. Something else is driving that number." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want to look at their GitHub repos. If Ashley's team built something proprietary, there should be commit history, architecture documents, patent filings. Can you get me read access to the company's technical documentation drive?" I still had residual admin credentials from my CFO role, not through any device Richard might monitor, but through a cloud backup service I'd set up years ago for financial disaster recovery, one Richard didn't know still existed because he'd never cared about the technical side of the business. Sophia spent the entire weekend in that drive. Sunday night, she called me, and I could hear something in her voice I'd never heard before: genuine alarm. "Mom, you need to sit down. The core recommendation algorithm, the actual product Bennett Technologies is about to sell to the public. The patent filing isn't under the company's name. It's under Reed Holdings LLC. It was filed 14 months ago. Dad transferred the IP assignment 2 years before that, right around the time he diluted your equity." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. "So the company going public doesn't actually own its own product," Sophia finished. "It's licensing it back from Ashley's shell company. There's a licensing agreement buried in a subfolder. I found it. Bennett Technologies pays Reed Holdings a percentage of revenue in perpetuity for the right to use the very algorithm your engineers built, using your money, over the last 5 years." I asked Sophia how she'd even known to look for a licensing agreement buried that deep. She said it was something she'd learned watching me for years, without either of us ever nomming it. I had taught her, mostly by example, that the real story in any financial document is rarely in the headline number. It's in the footnote nobody reads, the subfolder nobody opens, the line item everyone assumes someone else has already checked. "You do this every time you help me with my own budget, Mom," she said. "You always ask what's underneath the number, not just what the number says. I just did that to Dad's company instead of my grocery spreadsheet." It was, strangely, one of the kindest things anyone said to me during the entire ordeal, not because it minimized what was happening, but because it reminded me that the very habits Richard had built his fraud around exploiting were also the habits that would ultimately expose him. My carefulness hadn't been my weakness. It had been on loan to my daughter this whole time, waiting for the moment it would matter most. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a wronged wife and started feeling like a witness to a crime that was about to hurt 300 strangers who trusted my signature on those financial statements. I took everything: the bank statements, Alina's forensic analysis, the real estate deeds, Sophia's technical findings, the licensing agreement, and I compiled it into a single evidence file. 350 pages, organized chronologically, every claim cross-referenced with source documents. I did this the way I had built every financial report for 15 years, meticulously, without a single unsupported assertion. Then I called David Morrison, our corporate attorney, on a Tuesday afternoon while Richard was at a strategy offsite that I now understood was almost certainly at Ashley's penthouse. "David," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "I need to resign as CFO of Bennett Technologies, effective immediately. I need you to prepare the paperwork today." There was a long pause. "Victoria, the IPO is in 3 weeks. If you resign now, the underwriters are legally required to pause the offering. The SEC mandates continuity of the CFO position for at least 6 months prior to filing. This will blow up the entire timeline. I know, I said. That's not a bug, David. That's the point. What's going on? I told him. Not everything. I didn't trust the phone line completely by that point, but enough. Enough that David went quiet for almost 30 seconds. Victoria, he finally said, I've been this company's attorney for 12 years. I need you to understand something. Once you file this, I have professional obligations. I may not be able to represent Richard anymore. This isn't a small thing you're setting in motion. I understand, I said. Prepare the resignation paperwork. And David, I need the name of a securities attorney who specializes in whistleblower cases. Someone who doesn't currently have a relationship with Bennett Technologies. He gave me a name that afternoon. A woman named Claire Simmons, a former SEC enforcement attorney who now ran her own boutique whistleblower practice. I called her the next morning from Alina's office, using Alina's landline. Claire listened to my summary for 11 minutes without interrupting once. When I finished, she said, Victoria, based on what you've described, you likely qualify for SEC whistleblower protections and a potential award under the Dodd-Frank whistleblower program. But I need to see the documentation before I can advise you on strategy. Can you come to my office tomorrow? I did. Claire's office was a converted loft in the financial district, all exposed brick and framed newspaper clippings of cases she'd won. She spent 4 hours going through my dossier, occasionally stopping to ask sharp, precise questions, the kind that told me she'd built cases like this before and knew exactly where prosecutors would look for weaknesses. This is strong, she said finally. Stronger than most whistleblower cases I've seen come through this office. But I want to be honest with you about what happens next. If we file this with the SEC, they will open a formal investigation. That investigation will very likely include a deposition, a sworn interview where you answer questions under oath about everything you know. It will be recorded. It may eventually become part of the public record if this goes to trial. I understand. I don't think you do yet, Claire said, not unkindly. Because once you file this, you don't control it anymore. The SEC will investigate on their own timeline. Richard's attorneys will try to discredit you, expect them to argue you're a bitter spouse fabricating evidence out of revenge. They will dig into your personal life, your finances, anything they can use. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the 12 years without a salary. The nights I stayed awake fixing cash flow problems while Richard slept. The penthouse funded by money I had personally, unknowingly, helped steal from myself. Been prepared for this my entire marriage, I said. I just didn't know it. Claire asked me one more question before we left her office that day, one that stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. Victoria, I have to ask this plainly, because I ask every client this before we file. Do you want justice, or do you want reconciliation? Because sometimes people say they want the former when what they're actually hoping for is that filing this complaint will shock their spouse into becoming a different person. I need to know which one you're pursuing because the strategy is different. I sat with that question for almost a full minute. 6 months ago, I would have said reconciliation, I finally said. I would have told you I just wanted him to see me again, to remember why we started this. But he's had every opportunity over 15 years to see me. He chose not to. I'm not filing this to change him. I'm filing this because it's true, and because staying silent about something true just to protect a marriage that was already gone isn't reconciliation. It's just a slower kind of losing myself. Claire nodded slowly. Then we're filing for justice. That's the case I know how to build. Before I left her office that afternoon, Claire walked me to the door and said one more thing, almost as an aside. Victoria, in 12 years doing this work, I've represented a lot of whistleblowers. Most of them come to me angry, and anger burns out somewhere around month 4, right when the case needs them most. You're not angry. You're something steadier than that, and I think it's going to serve you a lot better over the next year than anger ever would have. I didn't fully understand what she meant until much later, sitting in that federal courthouse gallery watching Denise cry on the stand, feeling something closer to recognition than rage. Anger wants a villain. What I felt most days was closer to clarity. The simple, unglamorous work of laying every fact next to every other fact, until the truth had nowhere left to hide. We filed the complaint with the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower that Thursday. 2 days later, I sat across from a federal agent named Rebecca Miller in a small, windowless conference room in the SEC's San Francisco regional office. Claire seated beside me, a court reporter typing quietly in the corner. The deposition lasted 6 hours, broken only by 2 short recesses. Agent Miller walked me through every document in painstaking detail. She asked me to explain, in my own words, the exact process by which I discovered the equity dilution. She asked me to authenticate my own signature versus the forged one, comparing loops and pressure points under a magnifying glass she produced from a case. She asked about the product strategy advisory line item, and I had to admit on the record that I had personally approved it, a moment that made my stomach drop, even though Claire had prepared me for the question and Agent Miller made clear this didn't implicate me, since I'd had no knowledge of the underlying fraud. MS. Bennett, Agent Miller said near the end of the session, closing her folder, I want to be direct with you. Based on the intellectual property findings alone, this rises well beyond a marital dispute over assets. If Bennett Technologies goes public without disclosing that its core product IP is licensed from a shell company controlled by an executive, that's a material misrepresentation to every single investor in that offering. That's securities fraud, full stop. What happens now? Now we move fast, she said. The IPO is in 17 days. We need to build enough to act before that offering closes, or investors lose real money and our case gets a lot more complicated. I'm going to be honest with you. We may ask for your cooperation in ways that go beyond paperwork. What does that mean? Agent Miller exchanged a glance with Claire. It means we may ask you to wear a recording device at a company event if the opportunity arises to get your husband or Ms. Reed to make an incriminating statement on record in a setting where they believe they're speaking freely. It's not required, but it would significantly strengthen the case, and given the compressed timeline, it could be the difference between an 8-month investigation and an emergency injunction before the IPO even opens. I thought about the launch party Richard had already scheduled, the celebration at the St. Regis, 300 investors, the same event he'd asked me to stand beside him for, to smile, to play my part. There's a party in 12 days, I said. He wants me there. Claire sat forward. Victoria, you don't have to say yes to this. I know, I said, but I want to. The next 12 days, I lived 2 lives. In one, I was Victoria Bennett, dutiful wife, helping Richard finalize catering choices for the launch party, nodding along as he practiced his keynote speech in the mirror, kissing him goodnight. In the other, I met with Agent Miller's team 3 times to be fitted with recording equipment and briefed on protocol, met twice more with Claire to review my legal position, and spent every spare hour with Alina verifying that our evidence file was airtight enough to survive cross-examination. The hardest part wasn't the deception. It was watching Richard, in unguarded moments, be tender with me, bringing me coffee in the morning, telling me he couldn't have built any of this without me, and realizing that even now, even after everything, some small, exhausted part of me wanted to believe him. That part of me had been married to him for 15 years. It didn't disappear just because the evidence did. Sophia stayed with me most nights during that stretch. She didn't say much. She just made sure I ate, made sure I slept, made sure I didn't spiral into second-guessing a decision I had already fundamentally made. The night before the party, she sat on the edge of my bed the way she used to when she was small and couldn't sleep. She said, "Are you scared?" "Terrified," I admitted. "Good," she said. "That means you understand how big this is, but you're the most precise person I've ever known. You're not doing this out of anger. You're doing it because it's true. That's different." That's stronger. The morning of the party, I met Agent Miller's technician in a hotel room 3 blocks from the St. Regis. She fitted a small recording device into the clasp of a necklace, an anniversary gift from Richard 4 years ago, which felt like its own kind of quiet justice. "Remember," Agent Miller said, "you don't need to extract a confession. You just need him talking. Let him fill the silence." People who think they've gotten away with something love to talk about it, especially when they think they're celebrating. St. Regis Ballroom was exactly as grand as Richard had promised the planning committee it would be: crystal chandeliers, white orchids on every table, a stage banked with screens displaying the Bennett Technologies logo in slow rotation. 300 guests, venture capitalists in tailored suits, institutional investors comparing notes over champagne, board members greeting each other with the practiced warmth of people who'd known each other across a dozen deals, and press photographers circling the room for candid shots. Richard was radiant. I want to be honest about that, because it's part of the truth. He was, in that moment, exactly the man 300 people believed him to be: charismatic, confident, generous with his attention. He worked the room like he'd been born for it. Ashley stood near the stage in an emerald green dress, greeting board members by name, laughing at the right moments, playing a role I now understood she had been rehearsing for years. I found Agent Miller's 2 undercover colleagues near the floral arrangements by the stage, indistinguishable from catering staff. I found the head of our lead underwriting bank, a woman named Susan Delgado, whose firm had put $40 million behind this offering, and made careful, unremarkable small talk with her for 11 minutes, long enough for the recorder to capture her saying, unprompted, how impressed she was by Richard's product vision. A statement that would later matter more than I expected, because it established, on record, exactly what investors believed they were buying. Richard found me near the bar an hour into the event, flushed with champagne and adrenaline. "There she is," he said, sliding an arm around my waist. "My brilliant CFO. 5 years from now, when we're sitting on a beach somewhere, we're going to look back at tonight and remember it as the night everything changed." "It's going to be a night to remember," I said, and meant it more than he understood. "Ashley thinks we should announce the Series D expansion next quarter, right on the heels of the IPO," he said, lowering his voice slightly, the way he did when he thought he was sharing something clever. "Nobody will even notice the licensing fee line item. It's buried 3 layers deep in the S1. Auditors barely blink at royalty structures like that anymore." I felt the recorder against my collarbone like a held breath. "You're not worried anyone will ask questions?" Richard laughed, waving a hand. "Victoria, come on. You signed off on the advisory fee restructuring yourself 2 years ago. Nobody's going to connect Reed Holdings to the patent filing unless they're specifically looking for it. And why would they be looking? Everyone in this room just wants their return." It was, almost word for word, exactly what Agent Miller had hoped for. He kissed my temple and drifted back toward a cluster of board members, and I stood there for a long moment, feeling the full, physical weight of 15 years collapsing into a single recorded sentence. Richard's speech began 40 minutes later. He spoke about vision, about disruption, about the sleepless nights that had built Bennett Technologies from a garage idea into a company worth, by his own estimate, over $400 million. The crowd applauded warmly. He raised his glass. "To Bennett Technologies, to the future." Then he turned, found me in the crowd, and gestured me toward the stage. "And I'd like to invite my wife, our brilliant CFO, the woman who has been the backbone of this company since day one, to say a few words." Applause swelled. I walked to the stage slowly, feeling 300 pairs of eyes track my movement, feeling Sophia's gaze from near the back of the room, steady and unwavering. Richard handed me the microphone and kissed my cheek. "Smile, babe," he whispered. "We made it." I stepped to the podium. I looked out at the room, at Susan Delgado, whose firm had put $40 million on the line, at the young analysts who would lose their year-end bonuses if this deal collapsed badly enough, at Ashley near the edge of the stage, her smile already beginning to falter, as if some animal instinct had picked up on the shift in the air before her mind caught up. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. 15 years ago, I joined my husband to build a company on trust, transparency, and partnership. I worked without a salary for 12 of those years because I believed in that partnership completely." I paused. The room was still applauding faintly, not yet understanding. 3 weeks ago, while reviewing the final IPO documentation, I discovered that my equity stake had been illegally diluted from 40% to 5%, using a forged signature. Applause died. A ripple of confused murmurs moved through the crowd. I discovered that $1.8 million in company funds had been systematically transferred, disguised as consulting fees, to a shell company owned by our VP of Product, Ashley Reed, who used those funds to purchase a $2.1 million penthouse. Ashley's face drained of color. Richard stepped toward me, his hand half raised. "Victoria, I also discovered," I continued, raising my voice over him, "that the core intellectual property of Bennett Technologies, the algorithm this entire company and this entire offering is built on, is not owned by Bennett Technologies. It was quietly transferred to that same shell company 2 years ago. The company you are all being asked to invest in tonight does not own its own product. It licenses it back, in perpetuity, from a company owned by the CEO's business partner. Room shattered into noise. Investors stood up from their tables. A board member near the front shouted something I couldn't make out. Susan Delgado had gone completely white, her phone already in her hand. "Cut her mic," Richard shouted, lunging toward the podium. "She's not well, she's been under enormous stress." "I am not stressed, Richard," I said, stepping back just far enough that he couldn't reach the microphone. "I am precise, as of this morning. I have formally resigned as Chief Financial Officer of Bennett Technologies. I have also submitted a 350-page evidentiary file to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, detailing wire fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and material misrepresentation to investors." That was when the two men near the floral arrangements moved. "Richard Bennett," the taller agent said, his voice cutting cleanly through the chaos as he produced credentials from his jacket. "Federal Agents, Securities and Exchange Commission. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement. Please step away from the stage." Richard turned to look at me, and for the first time in 15 years, I watched every ounce of confidence drain out of his face in real time. "Victoria," he said, his voice suddenly small, "please, we can fix this. We can fix this together." "You had 15 years to fix it, Richard," I said. "You chose to steal instead." Near the back of the ballroom, I watched a young analyst I recognized from Susan Delgado's firm. A woman who couldn't have been older than 26, turn to her colleague, her face pale, and whisper something I would learn the substance of only later. Her firm had personally recommended this offering to 12 of their private wealth clients, individuals, not institutions, who had trusted her first-hand assessment of Bennett Technologies' fundamentals. She would spend the better part of the next year fielding phone calls from those 12 families, explaining what had happened, rebuilding trust one difficult conversation at a time. I think about her sometimes, a stranger whose name I never learned, because she represents something I didn't fully appreciate in the moment. Fraud like this doesn't just damage the people who commit it or the people closest to them. It ripples outward through everyone who ever vouched for it in good faith. They handcuffed him in front of 300 people who had come to make him wealthier. Camera flashes strobed across the ballroom. Ashley tried to slip toward a side exit near the kitchen, but a third agent intercepted her before she reached the door. I stepped down from the stage. David Morrison, who had come as a guest, stood frozen near the bar, his mouth slightly open. Susan Delgado caught my arm as I passed. "Is this real?" she asked quietly. "All of it?" "Every word," I said. "I have the documentation. My attorney will be in touch with your legal team within the hour." I found Sophia waiting near the coat check, my jacket already in her hands. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's done," I said. We walked out into the cool San Francisco night. I could hear the chaos still unfolding behind the closed ballroom doors, raised voices, someone crying, the particular sound of an entire room recalibrating everything it thought it knew. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I took a full, unhurried breath. Sophia drove me home that night. Neither of us spoke much on the ride, but somewhere around the Bay Bridge, she reached over and turned on the radio low, just enough to fill the silence without demanding anything from either of us. When we got to my house, the house I would sell within the year, I sat on the front steps for a long time, still in my black dress, while Sophia made tea we didn't drink. My phone didn't stop ringing that night. Susan Delgado's general counsel called at 11, asking for an emergency call with Claire first thing in the morning. A reporter from a business publication I'd read for years called at midnight, having already gotten a tip from someone at the party. I didn't answer. My sister Karen called at 1 in the morning, having seen a photo of the arrest already circulating online, and I finally cried on the phone with her, not out of grief, but out of something closer to release, the particular exhaustion of having carried something enormous and finally being able to set it down. "You did the right thing," Karen said. "You know that, right?" "I know it in my head," I said. "I'm not sure my body's caught up yet." By 6 the next morning, the story had made 3 national business outlets. By 9, Bennett Technologies' remaining board members had convened an emergency call, without Richard, to discuss how to handle federal seizure of company accounts. I wasn't invited to that call, and I didn't need to be. My job, as far as the company was concerned, had ended the moment I stepped off that stage. The aftermath moved faster than even Claire had predicted. The SEC froze all company accounts within 18 hours. The IPO was formally withdrawn the next morning. The underwriters had no choice, given the material misrepresentation now on federal record. Bennett Technologies filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy within 60 days. A group of investors, led by Susan Delgado's firm, filed a class action lawsuit seeking $45 million in damages related to the aborted offering and prior funding rounds. Richard's trial began 5 months later and lasted just under 4 months. His defense team, 3 attorneys from a prominent white-collar firm, tried early to paint me as a vindictive spouse who had fabricated evidence out of jealousy over the affair. That strategy collapsed during the second week, when the prosecution entered Sophia's technical findings into evidence. The original commit logs, time-stamped and cryptographically verifiable, showing the exact date the IP assignment had been altered, 2 full years before I had ever suspected anything was wrong. You cannot accuse someone of fabricating a git-commit history from 2022 to cover a 2024 divorce. Denise, the outside bookkeeper, testified under a limited immunity agreement, describing in flat, exhausted detail how Richard had asked her to structure the advisory payments in a way that wouldn't trigger automated audit flags. She explained that Richard had framed it to her as a legitimate, if unconventional, deferred compensation arrangement for Ashley, something he claimed he intended to formally disclose once the IPO dust settled. She testified that she had raised a mild concern once, early on, and that Richard had told her, almost gently, that she didn't need to worry about the details, that as CEO he had full authority over how the arrangement was documented. It was a small sentence, but sitting in the gallery, I recognized it instantly. It was the exact tone he used with me. For 15 years, every time I asked a question he didn't want to fully answer. Denise cried on the stand. I did not feel triumphant watching her. I felt tired, the way you feel after a long illness has finally, fully passed, and a strange, unexpected kinship with a woman I had never met before this case, who had also, in her own smaller way, trusted my husband's voice more than her own instincts. Ashley testified against Richard as part of a cooperation agreement, claiming he had directed every major decision and that she had gone along with it out of professional fear, and she admitted quietly genuine feelings for him that had clouded her judgment. The jury did not find her sympathetic, but her testimony corroborated the paper trail in ways that made Richard's remaining defenses nearly impossible to sustain. I testified on the 9th day of the trial. Claire had prepared me for cross-examination for 11 hours across 3 sessions, walking me through every possible angle Richard's attorneys might take. When the moment actually came, the lead defense attorney, a composed man named Gregory Ashford, spent nearly 2 hours trying to establish that I had known about the equity dilution for years and had simply waited for a moment of maximum leverage to expose it. MS. Bennett, he said, packing in front of the jury box, isn't it true that you personally approved the very line item that funded these so-called embezzled transfers? I approved a line item labeled Product Strategy Advisory, I said. I was told it funded an outside UX consultant. I was not shown the underlying contract. I was not told the recipient was a shell company controlled by my husband's romantic partner, formed the same month my equity was diluted using a forged signature. You're a trained financial professional with 15 years of experience running this company's books. Are you asking this jury to believe you simply didn't notice? Telling this jury, I said, that fraud designed by someone you trust completely, someone you've built a life and a company with for 15 years, doesn't announce itself. It's built specifically not to be noticed. That's not a flaw in my competence. That's the entire mechanism of the crime. Ashford tried a different angle after the recess, suggesting that my decision to wear a recording device at the launch party proved I had been planning a public spectacle rather than pursuing justice through proper channels. I filed a formal SEC whistleblower complaint 11 days before that party, I said. I retained independent counsel. I turned over 350 pages of documentation to federal investigators before I ever agreed to wear anything. The recording device wasn't my plan. It was a request from Agent Miller's team because they believed, correctly, that it would prevent hundreds of investors from losing their money in an offering built on a lie. If you'd like to characterize following federal investigators' instructions as staging a spectacle, that's your prerogative. I'd call it cooperating with the law. Judge Alvarez sustained an objection from the prosecution shortly after, and Ashford moved on. I remember very little else about the cross-examination in detail. The adrenaline made the rest blur together, but I remember Sophia's face in the gallery afterward, and the small, fierce nod she gave me as I stepped down from the stand. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. Richard was found guilty on all 7 counts: securities fraud, wire fraud, 3 counts of embezzlement, forgery, and making false statements to federal regulators. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later. Judge Alvarez allowed victim impact statements before issuing her ruling. Susan Delgado spoke on behalf of the 12 private clients who had lost a combined $3.4 million in the collapsed offering, several of them retirees who had trusted her firm's recommendation. 2 former Bennett Technologies employees spoke about losing their jobs and their unvested equity when the company collapsed into bankruptcy, describing mortgages they'd nearly defaulted on in the months since. I chose to speak as well, though Claire had told me I wasn't obligated to. I kept it short. I told the court that the hardest part of this entire ordeal was not the financial loss, though the financial loss was real. The hardest part was learning that the version of my marriage I had spent 15 years defending to myself, on nights when something felt wrong and I talked myself out of noticing it, had never actually existed. I told the judge that I wasn't asking for a specific sentence. I was only asking that the court recognize that trust, once weaponized this precisely, and this patiently, causes a kind of damage that doesn't show up on a restitution ledger. Judge Alvarez sentenced Richard to 10 years in federal prison and ordered $22 million in restitution, a figure that would take the rest of his working life, if he ever worked again, to repay. Before adjourning, she added a comment that wasn't part of the formal ruling, but that I've thought about often since. Mr. Bennett, the court notes that the most troubling element of this case isn't the sophistication of the fraud. It's the 15 years of unpaid labor that made it possible for you to commit it undetected. I hope you understand what you took, and from whom, long after this sentence concludes. Ashley received a suspended sentence and 5 years of probation in exchange for her cooperation. She was permanently barred from serving as an officer of any publicly traded company. She lost the penthouse in a forfeiture order 6 weeks after the verdict. The last I heard, secondhand, through a mutual former colleague, she had moved to Denver and was working in an unrelated field, using a version of her name that wasn't quite the one on her original birth certificate. I filed for divorce the week the SEC froze our accounts, and it was finalized while Richard was still awaiting sentencing. Because the marital estate had been so thoroughly documented through the SEC investigation, the settlement was, ironically, one of the more straightforward parts of the entire ordeal. I received my full 40% equity interest, restored by court order, in what remained of the company's liquidated assets, along with half of the marital home's proceeds after it sold. It wasn't 15 years of back pay. Nothing could have been, but it was enough to start something new. Sophia and I used a portion of the settlement to found Benetrays Forensic Advisory, a consulting firm. I took my mother's maiden name, Ray's, for the new venture, a small, deliberate act of reclaiming something that was entirely my own. We specialize in exactly the kind of fraud that nearly destroyed me, helping early-stage founders structure clean cap tables, verify IP ownership before major funding rounds, and build financial controls that make the kind of quiet theft I lived through much harder to hide. In our first 18 months, we've helped 4 startups catch structural irregularities before they became criminal ones. 2 of those founders cried in our conference room when they realized how close they'd come to losing everything without ever knowing it. The first client we ever took on was a 29-year-old founder named Marcus, referred to us by Claire, who had a co-founder pushing hard for a funding round on a timeline that felt, to Marcus, oddly urgent. It took Alina 4 days to find what Marcus's own accountant had missed for over a year. A pattern of vendor overpayments rooted through a company registered to the co-founder's brother. It wasn't as large as what Richard had built, And it wasn't dressed up with a forged signature or a stolen algorithm. But watching Marcus's face change as we laid the pattern out for him, watching him go through the same disorienting shift from trust to clarity that I had gone through in Alina's Oakland coffee shop, I understood exactly why I'd started this firm. Not for the income, though the income mattered. For the chance to hand someone else the 11 hours it took me to finally see what was in front of me the entire time. Alina Rodriguez joined us 6 months in, leaving her independent practice to become our lead forensic partner. The three of us built something I'm genuinely proud of, not because it's large or because it will ever be worth what Bennett Technologies claim to be worth on paper, but because every dollar our clients pay us is a dollar they know exactly where it came from and exactly where it's going. There is nothing hidden in our ledgers. I made sure of that on the day we filed our incorporation papers, and I check it personally, every single quarter, not because I don't trust my own team, but because I promised myself I would never again let blind trust stand in for verification, no matter how much I love the people around me. I still think about David Morrison sometimes. He couldn't continue representing either of us once the case moved forward, a conflict of interest, given his history with the company, but he sent me a short note after the sentencing. "You were always the one holding this company together," he wrote. "I should have seen what that cost you." I appreciated it, though I've made my peace with the fact that most of the people who watched me disappear into that role for 12 years never fully saw it, not because they were cruel, but because I made myself very easy not to notice. I don't do that anymore. My relationship with my own body took longer to repair than my finances did. For the first few months after the trial ended, I still woke up at 5 in the morning out of habit, reaching for a laptop that no longer had payroll deadlines attached to it. Sophia suggested therapy, gently, the way she suggests most things, and I finally went. My therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Osai, once asked me what I would say to the version of myself sitting at that warehouse desk 8 years ago, folding grief into a spreadsheet. I didn't have an answer for a long time. Eventually, I did. I would tell her that the company was never going to love her back, no matter how much of herself she poured into it, and that the only entity capable of doing that was the one she kept putting last. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a letter from Richard, forwarded through his attorney. His handwriting was smaller than I remembered, shakier. "Victoria, I am so sorry. I was arrogant. I thought I could take whatever I wanted because you would always be there to clean up whatever mess I made. I convinced myself you needed me more than I needed you, and I was wrong about that, and about everything else. I think about the early years constantly, before any of this happened, before I let ambition turn into something else. I hope, someday, you can forgive me." I read it once, sitting at my kitchen table in the small house I bought entirely on my own. No joint accounts, no shared signatures, nothing that could be quietly rewritten behind my back ever again. Then I fed it into the shredder next to my desk, the same one I use for sensitive client documents. I don't hate him. Hatred takes energy, and I've learned to spend my energy more carefully than I used to. But I will not forgive him either, not because forgiveness isn't possible, but because forgiveness, to mean anything, requires more than a letter written from a federal prison after every alternative has run out. It requires the kind of accountability Richard has never once shown me, not in 15 years, not even now. Sophia asked me once, not long after the shredder ate that letter, whether I regretted any of it, the 12 unpaid years, the marriage itself, the version of my life I might have had if I'd asked harder questions sooner. I told her the truth. I don't regret loving him when I did. I regret how long it took me to notice that love, on its own, was never going to be enough evidence that someone deserved my trust. Evidence requires documentation. It requires verification. It requires the same rigor I applied to every balance sheet I ever built for that company, and for 15 years, I simply never thought to apply it to the man standing beside me while I built it. I apply it now to everything. Not out of cynicism, but out of self-respect. It's a small, quiet shift, and it has changed the entire shape of how I move through the world. What I learned through all of this is something I didn't expect to learn at 42 years old. After 2 decades of believing, I already understood my own worth. I learned that worth isn't determined by what someone else is willing to pay you, in salary, or in loyalty, or in equity. It's determined by what you're finally willing to refuse to accept. I refuse to accept being erased from a company I built with my own 2 hands. I refuse to accept a signature that wasn't mine standing in for a consent I never gave. I refuse to accept silence as the price of keeping the peace. You don't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes the quietest people, the ones who have spent years being careful and precise and endlessly patient, are exactly the ones capable of the loudest reckoning, because we've had all that time to get the details right. So tell me honestly, have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your own worth? What finally gave you the strength to stop staying quiet? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. And remember, you are the author of your own life. Don't let anyone else hold the pen. I'll see you in the next one.